Okay, you guys ready? I'm gonna.
What do we do? We just will this at anyone that's having it.
Well, you're mic'd up, so you're fine. But the audience is gonna throw this around. I'm gonna do a little demo. Okay, is this on? Okay. Good evening. So your first question is why am I talking into a bright blue cube? It's a good question, and I'll start with that, in fact. My name is Marcus Carlson-Jones. I'm on the Alumni Relations team at the University of Manchester. Firstly, thank you very much for joining us tonight to discuss the post-Brexit reality. I'd just like to say a hello to our audience on. We've done a few of these now. This is the first event of the 16-17 year. We've been doing this for a year already. It can slow it down a little bit when you are, very carefully handing around an expensive microphone. So my colleague here, Catherine, saw this video, a demo for a throwable microphone. So.
Yes, it's entirely my fault.
I love the idea, so we've rented one tonight. If we think it works, we'll do it again, and maybe in time get a nice branded one with the university logo on it if we really want to go the whole hog. But the idea tonight is we want to keep the pace going, so we really want you to the bulk of this event is about Q&A. So we've got a panel of experts here. They're expert in different areas, but we think areas that all have a really interesting relevance to the future of the UK outside of the EU. So what I'm going to do now is just show you, I'm sure I don't need to show you how to throw a microphone, but I don't want you to be afraid that you're going to break it, because you can't. It's very well cushioned. So I'm just going to throw it to Catherine here.
He's famous for not being able to catch. And if I can do it, anybody can. So our hope with this is not that you're going to throw it at me because you don't like the way that the discussion is going. That's quite important. I'm also going to ask you to respect moving it on. Remember being children and playing pass the parcel, and there's always somebody that hangs on to the parcel in the hope. Please make sure it's moving around, and we'll make sure that we get lots of voices heard. So perhaps if I pass it back to Marcus. Oh, and I've also been told that our guest dog won't be jumping to catch it. So.
Okay, and there's a little thing underneath, so you can put it on your hand, so you don't have to feel like you're speaking into a cereal bowl. So I'm not going to talk for much longer. I just want to point out a few things that are on your information sheet. So page 1 is all about your speakers here, so you can just see a little bit what their background is and what their one-liner about the subject is. On the reverse side, we've got some more information, just a little reminder of who the ministers responsible for the UK's exit of the EU. We also found, again, Catherine suggested this, and I went with it. The Financial Times are doing a project, the Future of Britain project, and that is very nicely centred around 4 questions, which we've spelled out for you there on page 2. So we think that's a useful way of kind of starting to approach the question. How do you kind of break the subject down? How do you sort of penetrate it with some useful questions? So you can feel free to ask those yourself if you think you want to know what the answer is. But we'd encourage you to become a part of that project. It's one where you're invited to submit your own comments. Finally, there's one thing right at the bottom of sheet 2, which is page 2 of your info sheet, which is Manchester Network. So we've very recently got this set up through our website. If you go onto our website now and update your details, you do that through what's called Manchester Network. There's a wider aspect to that platform. That's going to become an online mentoring platform. So that's what will allow you to mentor other alumni and current students through our website. So it's kind of a very sort of detailed, highly interactive, kind of closed LinkedIn just for alumni of this university. So go there, update your details, say what you're willing to do for in terms of acting as a mentor, and in time we'll promote that further and tell you more about it. So I'm going to leave it there. I'd again just encourage you to come forward with your questions, whether you're in the room or you're watching online at home. So I'll now hand over to Catherine.
Thank you, Marcus. So welcome everyone. My name's Catherine Leopold, and I'm here in my capacity as London Coordinator for the Alumni Advisory Board. That essentially means that I sit in on advisory board meetings saying, what about London? After every topic, and doing my best to make sure that the voice of London alumni are heard. As Marcus said, this is the first of this series in the academic year 2016-2017. Apart from Maria, all of tonight's panellists have joined previous panels where we've talked about crisis management, we've talked about change management, we've talked about negotiation, and we've talked about future talent. And when the referendum result happened, we thought it would be interesting to bring back speakers and introduce new blood into the panel, because that's always good, to kind of think about the situation that we find ourselves in and drawing on their own professional experience and commentary. So the panel are going to be sharing a mixture of professional and personal opinions. I am very, very conscious of how high emotions are running in anything to do with Brexit, and we're anticipating quite a spirited debate. All I ask is that you don't use the microphone as a weapon. If we can get through tonight with nobody doing that and we have an interesting conversation, then I think I will deem it an enormous success. So what I'm now going to do is invite the panellists to give you a short kind of introduction to their thoughts around their frame for this evening, and then we'll move over to you guys to take some questions and to have some conversations and discussions around those themes. So I thought we might start with Bob, who appeared on our crisis management panel. Whether or not you think we're in crisis, we've invited him to go first.
Thanks, Catherine. Well, crisis, what crisis, I guess, is the start point. Is Brexit a crisis? Some would say probably. Some would say definitely. I think I would be of the view of no, not yet. Could it become one? Yes, of course. Individually, collectively, corporately. I think definitely it could if if the right processes aren't followed in terms of getting geared up for what is going to come down the road. Interestingly, I mean, I used to be, as you've probably seen from the sheet, I used to be in the Air Force for a long time, did a lot of senior level crisis management with government. I now work for Deloitte. Deloitte did a lot of work in advance of the referendum around Brexit. And in common with most organisations, we were right up to the day of the vote itself, pretty much on the it's going to be a Remain vote. So, on that basis, we were quite relaxed, but we'd done a reasonable amount of preparation, both in terms of from an actual internal firm perspective, but also, of course, for all of the clients that we deal with. Of course, it didn't quite work out that way. So the 24th of June turned into a rather more interesting day than perhaps we'd expected, and the subsequent few weeks was very interesting. It was very interesting on a number of levels, because I think when you look at the level of preparedness that then shone out from various industry sectors, it was quite striking. The financial services sector, perhaps unsurprisingly, had done the most. It's a generalisation, of course. There'll be variances across that, and it's true for for the wider industry groupings as well. But there was a lot of preparation that had been done in financial services, because I think they had looked upon it as a really serious risk for them, and therefore had some plans in place that they're now moving into a much more active phase of implementation stroke wider detailed discussion. An awful lot of other industries had actually done very, very little. And partly that was because they were actually expecting it to be a Remain vote. and I think as a result, it's just not worth worrying about. And also just because it just wasn't really on their radar, bizarrely, despite all of the coverage and so on that went on around it. Does that matter? Not really, given the timeline of the whole thing playing out now. But what's certainly true is that in terms of mitigating that crisis moment, planning is key to taking it forward from now on. And obviously, planning not only for what might happen once we actually leave and how that might play out, but also planning in terms of lobbying and pushing the government and the European Union, for that matter, particularly for companies that have got a European presence, to steer the negotiations in a way that clearly is working for them. And unsurprisingly, very much in the news, huge amounts of activity now going on to try and make that right. I mean, clearly, if I was a trade negotiator, I probably wouldn't be sitting here now. I'd be busy looking at my Aston Martin brochure for commanding my my next few years' salary, because I think there's a huge demand for those sorts of people with the right skills to be able to negotiate what is undoubtedly going to be a serious challenge going forward. I think I'll stop there, but I'm sure there'll be lots of other stuff in questions.
Yeah, I think most definitely. And now, Barnaby, perhaps if you could offer some thoughts. Barnaby spoke on the change management panel originally.
So I run a pan-European recruitment business. We have offices in Germany, Netherlands and UK. We are busy investing in our offices in Germany and the Netherlands and not investing quite so much in the UK. And I suspect that I'm typical of an organisation, of a British or European organisation right now. A lot of the clients that we work with are financial institutions, so JP Morgan, UBS, Willis, across investment management, insurance and so on. And the overriding impression I'm getting from those people is, first of all, actually I'm surprised to hear that many of them were prepared, because in the scattering of lunches that I've had since the Brexit decision vote, whatever you want to call it, actually what came out was they might have thought about it, but they hadn't done a great deal about it. And the impression I now have is that in any great change management programme, we are still in the status quo. There's still loads of anger, court cases, Facebook rants, demos, etc. And that's kind of the stage that we seem to be at throughout all of our clients. I don't think that we are about to see a sudden exodus of people. I don't think banks or anyone else is about to make a decision to move. And I think the reason for that is there are plenty of other centres of crisis around the world, whether it's the US or the rest of Europe or whatever. What I do think the danger for the UK is, and my angle would be from a people perspective, is that while we are faffing around, arguing, negotiating, etc., organisations are making their decisions to hire their people in other places, and that might be technology-led, it might be offshore, remote working, etc. And the UK just isn't going to be equipped in order to be able to compete with a host of other countries where these people, decisions, that organisations will land. So my current feeling is we are in a status quo, but and as a bit of running a recruitment business, it's a great opportunity, but for the UK, it leaves me a little bit concerned, and I am British.
And our Peter spoke on our negotiation panel, and I felt it was particularly pertinent that we had a negotiation perspective this evening.
So I'd like to frame the mindset and the landscape of this negotiation. And absolutely, it's a boom time for negotiators. And we've got to talk about Brexit negotiations, but also there's a lot of Brexit-related negotiations going on at the moment. So what do we have? We have the formal Great British Break-Off, starting in March 2017, as the PM tells us it will. Then we will have negotiations as a third-party country about our future relationship with the EU. At the same time, there are negotiations and some secret deals on a sector-specific basis. We know, because we've heard there's been some sort of deal struck with Nissan. And I guess, and I think that there will be some more colour around what other deals are being struck. And then there are the scoping negotiations going on about our future relationships with other countries. And we've seen the empire strike back recently with India, saying, oh yes, of course, free trade will be great, but you need to let the Indians into your country. So an issue there. But what do we know about the negotiations themselves? Well, David Davis says, you're not going to know very much. And even in private, I'm not going to tell you very much. And he says, because that process of communicating our negotiations is going to undermine our negotiation strategy. As a negotiator, I agree with him. I agree with him that there cannot be a blow-by-blow account of every part of this negotiation. When you come to the table at the negotiation, you have to have a strategy. You absolutely have to have a strategy. You have to know what a good outcome looks like. You have to know what your worst case scenario is. And in between, the negotiation will move. Because right now, we will scope what we think the EU wants, but we won't know all the detail of that. And so things will move. And therefore, I think that we should know what the direction of travel is, but I think we know quite a lot. I think it's unfair to say at the moment that we don't know much at all. I can tell you what I think we know. I'll come to that. But what I think will be important is to understand in the negotiation, and I always think it's important, the first thing is to know what your client wants. The first thing I do is scope the objectives. What does my client want out of this negotiation? So who is the client in this negotiation? Well, the client appears to be the people. And who are the people? The people of the country, but also the engines of our economy, the key businesses in this country. So where are we? What do the people want? Well, immigration-wise, what do the people want? Well, we're not really sure what the people want when it comes to immigration. They want to limit, I think, EU immigration, but they may also want to limit non-EU immigration. They may want no immigration. If we start from the basis that they want no immigration, that's not going to happen. It's not achievable. And I think we can see from the negotiations so far with India that my view is the PM is going to have to come clean quite quickly about the type of immigration we need in this country and what she thinks is achievable, because I don't think it's going to be credible to continue to say we're going to limit immigration to the tens of thousands. If India wants tens of thousands, China will want tens of thousands, Brazil will want, where do we lie with this? So I think we need to have a reasoned look at that. The people want sovereignty. Well, that's an interesting issue at the moment. Sovereignty, what does that mean? Well, I think what the people are saying is they want to extricate themselves. They want to emancipate themselves from the laws and regulations of the EU. They want to be less limited. And of course, what we do have at the moment is the announcement about the Great Repeal Bill. But that is somewhat of a misnomer. What the Great Repeal Bill will do is to enshrine EU law into domestic law. And then what will happen is incrementally we will decide what we want and what we don't want, and Parliament will decide that in due course. But it will not be today, tomorrow, or instantaneously. So we haven't got that either. And briefly, in terms of business, well, financial services, today I read that they still want full access to the single market, but most of all, in line with the tech and digital industries, they really also want access to a highly skilled migrant workforce. 20 to 30% of the UK workforce in investment banks comes from the EU. And the tech and digital industries we have the largest in Europe. We have 120 billion in trade, and it is the largest growth area, 6%. And their top priority is to ensure that we are able to continue with research, innovation, and growth in that area. So highly skilled migration is top on the agenda. Law, we want people to continue to come to this country as a centre of dispute resolution and litigate in our courts. And people, and the reason people do that, the reason countries do that and businesses do that, is there is the rule of law, there is certainty, there is finality, although the cost has increased in accessing justice in this country. Businesses generally, companies exporting, SMEs, another, the engine of our economy, want to ensure they aren't facing difficult barriers, bureaucratic and admin barriers due to coming out of the customs union. They don't want to face high trade tariffs. So we've got a lot of wants and asks, and the issue is how we marry that with what we can achieve. And there are models. There is some hope out there with the Canada-EU trade agreement. We are a massively affluent market, 65 million people, and there are lots of negotiating and bargaining chips we have: security, defence, foreign policy, things that we excel at that actually are very necessary. So a lot of fertile negotiating ground. I think that we already know. I think the hints have been laid by David Davis, who actually announced in September we were coming out of the single market and then got pretty much shut down. But I think that's where we are headed. But I think the immigration picture is a grey one at the moment, given what's just happened on the India trip.
Interesting thoughts already. So now I'd like to hand over to Paul, Director of Student Experience at Manchester, which I think in some ways is probably the least enviable.
Well, I'm Director of Student Life at the university, so that includes a whole range of different student support services, so careers and employability, disability, sport, all these sort of softer skill areas that we look after our 38,000 students. And we've recently had Welcome Week. It used to be called Freshers Week, but we banned that word because it encouraged too much licentious behaviour. So we now call it Welcome. I'm also responsible for off-campus discipline. And if you're familiar with a place called Fallowfield, you'll know exactly what that means and why I have no hair.
That's the least enviable.
So I was speaking to around 550 first-year students in Welcome Week, and I was asking them what they thought about Brexit, and they sort of said, meh, really, whatever. They were incredibly relaxed about it. And then I started talking to them more about their career expectations, and it struck me that from the research that we've done, this is the first group of students who they have a 50-50 chance of living to be 105. Okay, so this is a complete... Now, to put that in context, Manchester, 1900, the age of death for a man, on average, is 47. Okay, put your hands up if you're male and you're over 47. You live at borrowed time, ladies and gentlemen. Borrowed time. For women, it was 50. Okay, 50. So I've got 400 students in front of me, 105. Now, the London Business School, even before Brexit, they did some calculations, and they said if you're going to retire and have anything like a pension when you live to be 105, you're going to have to work a bit longer. How much longer? 82. 82. That's the only way you're going to have a pension that will give you a half-decent standard of living. 82. Now, the world of work was invented for 47. That was the idea. You get to 47, basically, that's it. That's your lot. 105, things are going to have to change. So that's the challenge we've got, even without Brexit. We've got bigger changes. Brexit's there, it's a major issue. But my biggest concern is that we don't want to accidentally prepare our students for the 20th century. We've been analysing at the university a whole series of jobs that are vanishing and will vanish even with Brexit. I call them zombie jobs. They're jobs that have been overtaken by technology and robots. To give you an idea, the number one zombie job, according to Deloitte, is chartered accountant. What's our biggest area of recruitment for our students? Chartered accountancy. So we've got major challenges if we're going to prepare our students for this future, even in a post-Brexit environment. So then I started looking at our data, because as you know, you'll know this yourself, we do surveys of our students to find out where they go when they graduate. my colleague Richard here, we used to work with me on these surveys. And I looked at what happened to last year's graduates and how many of them went to work on the continent in other EU countries. Do you know what percentage it was? Bearing in mind we're a top 25 university, outward facing, do you know what percentage go on to work outside the UK?
5.
1.4%. 1.4%. So you're more likely to work in Birmingham. You're more likely to work in Halifax than you are outside. So most of our students will work in the northwest of England. If they don't work in the northwest, they'll work here. They work in London. So for my concern, we've got the most stressed and anxious generation of students we've ever had. The most stressed. Mental health issues, panic, anxiety is sky high amongst this generation of students, not just at Manchester, everywhere. So I'm conscious that we give them the real information and we prepare them for the future of work without scaring the life out of them. Thank you.
I have to say I had dinner recently with one of the Manchester Global Graduate students from the previous year. For those that don't know, Manchester Global Graduate is a brilliant scheme. It's alumni funded, and widening participation students go through a competitive process and then get to have a week in London and Paris, or London, I think we've been to Singapore. And what they have are back-to-back meetings with alumni where they get to sit down and say, but how did you get to where you are? And the last one that I had was just before the referendum. So the conversation was one shape, took them for dinner up at the Shard and was talking about the wonderful place that London is. And then they were all emailing me afterwards going, right, so what now? And I was saying, well, I don't know, nobody knows. But one of the ones from the previous year had always seen her future as being in London, had secured the graduate job offer of her dreams in London, and was having a complete existential crisis about whether that was a good choice or not. So I think then that anxiety piece about what makes a good decision, I think is definitely expanding.
Yeah.
And then to finish this section, I'd like to hand over to Maria to talk about it from yet another perspective.
Hello, my name is Maria Nedeva and I'm Professor of Science and Innovation, Dynamics and Policy at Manchester University. But my research home is Manchester Institute of Innovation Research. Now, listening to everybody else, I realized that I'm in a pretty unique position on this panel. I'm British, but I have a clear accent, and it's Eastern European accent. And also, I'm the panel virgin, as you already know. Now, apart from that, what I was invited to tell you about is somewhat different from what my colleagues are telling you about, because what I do and what I've always done and what I've always wanted to do is to research the social conditions for science. How does science advance? What are the social conditions we can create for that? And of course, as part of that, it's about universities as well, right? So I would like to start, of course, I'm an academic, so I will start with my assumptions, and then I will reframe a problem that you have already seen kind of discussed in media, in our wonderful press, which is completely neutral and really exciting and full of humanity and intellectually good sense. I'm going to start with two assumptions, which I want to share with you. The first one is that many people don't realize that when we talk about science, it actually is a very large complex of things. So on the one hand, we have what I call the research space, which is usually bounded, it's usually national or regional, and this is where all the policy and funding conditions for science occur. Right? So from this point of view, we can talk about British science. But on the other hand, we have what I call research fields which have always been global. And when we talk about science as research fields, there is no such thing as British science, French science, or any other science. The last time people tried to do that with national science was around the Second World War, when the Soviets claimed that there is Soviet science and the Germans claimed that there is Aryan science, right? So I want to make this clear. Now, I will get back to this assumption. Now, the second assumption, and I already talked to somebody about that. Now, my position of being an adopted Brit puts me in a very interesting position, so I can look at my fellow Brits and think, where do you get your arrogance from, guys? How do you think that somebody will say, wow, you're so great that we will give you all the privileges without any of the responsibility, right? So when we talk about negotiation, as my colleague here mentioned, we will have to remember that there won't be this thing, oh, Brits, great, let's participate in all European programs, but you can limit immigration, you can not abide by European law, which, by the way, is our law anyway. We affected very much the setup of European legislation at different levels. So we have to be clear about these two things. Now, having been clear about these things, now let me ask you a question. What is the thing that you hear most about in relation to science regarding Brexit? Okay, it's about money. Money. Quite, it's money. And this again is very specific British things. My fellow Brits usually kind of don't realize that in many cases money is a byproduct, right? It's very important, but you focus a lot on money and you can get it very wrong, right? So if you focus about money, as it is in the press and science, the British government already said that they will underwrite the eventual funding from the European Union programs, which I have my doubts about whether they will do it, for how long they will do it, because, you know, when the budgets get tight, science and education are the first things to get cut, with possibly help, because the effects of this cut is very long term. So it doesn't fit in the short-termist thinking of politicians, usually. But actually, what I'm going to tell you today is that the biggest danger for science is not about money and funding. The biggest danger of Brexit for science is about two things that relate to the global nature of research fields I was telling you about. One of them is about loss of talent, and the other one is about loss of influence. Okay? Loss of talent, it is mainly about controlling migration. And we know that our Prime Minister, even when she was the Home Secretary, targeted very powerfully students from overseas as controlling immigration issue. Now, I think that anybody in this room can already figure out what the effects of this are on universities, how we conduct our business, as well as how we import talent for different industries later. Now, the loss of influence is a very interesting thing, and it's not as straightforward as the talent. By the way, talent is about scientists as well. So I was thinking to tell you, Britain was, a couple of years ago, and I suppose still is, the country that got most grants from the European Research Council. And these grants are very serious things, right? And they carry a lot of prestige, a lot of money, and a lot of everything. But do you know that they come to Britain, but they're mainly the Germans who work in British universities who get them, right? So this thing is very messed up with the global features of science. So the loss of influence, I believe, will come from the fact that at European level, there is a research space created that is comparable to any other national spaces in Europe at the moment. Knowledge communities in different research fields are being created at European level, right? And by cutting the links with Europe through Brexit, my worry is that this will limit the ability of scholars and scientists working in the UK to be effective participants in these global knowledge communities. And this is what will hurt us really a lot. And this will hurt each and every issue that we heard mentioned before. Now, Marcus distributed 4 questions, and the first one was what, in our opinion, is the best kind of relationship with Europe. And quite clearly, from the point of view of the science system, I believe that staying in the European Union probably was the best. Failing that, some sort of arrangement comparable to the ones of Norway, because Switzerland is an old shoe in this. They were kicked out of Horizon 20 because they stopped immigration, incidentally. But the difference between Britain and Norway is Norway never went on war with the European Union. They never talked half of the things that we here see being talked about. So I will stop here and thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's an interesting range of opinions. So Marcus is going to be collecting the questions from the webinar audience, so please do send those in through the wonders of technology. And I think it's now time for us to play with our new technology with the throwable microphone. So remember the pass the parcel rule. Otherwise I shall start singing so the music stops. So if we start here and then maybe come over to you.
Do you want to stand up? Okay, I'm gonna go for a big loop.
Yay, very good.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I have a question to the panel. Maybe Bob can help in his position working for a corporate audit firm. We talked about planning and how that's such an important factor for going forward into this process. And I was wondering, given recent developments and decision by Nissan to stay in the UK, whether or not other similar manufacturers have started planning around different scenarios and how that's playing out, and what sort of impact do you see in the economy going forward within the next year, couple of years?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I'm sure others will have a view as well. I think the answer is, have others started planning? Yeah, I certainly hope so. I mean, the advice that we have been offering consistently is don't do nothing, because there's plenty you can do to look at what the impact might be. The challenge, of course, for any organisation at the moment is there is so much variance between where we currently are and where we might end up, that it's quite difficult for a lot of organisations to really have any clarity around what the plan is going to be. What do I think you can do about that? I think you can look at what the maximum business change scenario is, which is effectively a World Trade Organization type rules, and the biggest difference from where we are now. And you can look at what does that mean for me and my business, and how might I operate under those circumstances. And that gives you some strategic questions that you need to then answer, and some actions you would have to take. And it starts to enable you to set a timeline that you would need to start making some of those decisions in. Because if you are particularly an organisation that has got significant tentacles into Europe, or even more globally, then if you are going to have to make significant changes, and particularly structural changes around IT systems and those sorts of things, then some of those will take time to implement. And understanding what the threshold is in terms of a decision timeline, so you are genuinely ready for whenever the exit moment actually happens and we are no longer a member of the European Union, then that's really important. If in the meantime the negotiation takes us to somewhere else, that is closer to where we are now but still outside the European Union, then all things are variances on that maximum business change plan. If you've started trying to plan for every conceivable eventuality, you'll drive yourself crazy, I think, with just too many options to deal with, and a whole load of plans you'll actually never use. So it does vary obviously by sector, and clearly if you're internally focused rather than externally focused, then your plans will be very different. If you're in right now in the British tourism industry, then you're probably smiling quite happily, because clearly with exchange rates the way they are, and the value of the pound versus other currencies, and pressure on staycations inevitably for UK citizens because they can't afford to go abroad, and and equally others looking at the UK and going, it's very attractive to come here now. It's a very different set of circumstances. If obviously your whole market is overseas, it's completely different. And if you're pricing stuff in dollars and so on, it's clearly very different. So there are some big things in there, but I think there's plenty of steps that companies can take and need to take.
I wonder if that's part of the difference between the conversations you're having from a risk advisory standpoint to the conversations you're having from the people who are actually pushing the change forward inside businesses. Because I think one of the things that struck me about listening to the debate is the way your question is framed is, who's doing what? I have a sense that everybody is playing their cards so close to their chest, waiting for somebody else to make the first move, that I don't feel that I have, as an outsider, a handle on how any one particular industry actually sees this playing out. And then that sense of the media hysteria kind of building behind it, I think can leave many people feeling at sea. But do you think there is that difference between the people kind of on the ground and the people thinking about it in global terms?
I think the one way to frame this whole debate is that here we are sitting in the UK, but I think a lot of the large organisations that do business in the UK are not UK organisations, and actually what they're looking at is not from the UK outwards how can they continue to do business with Europe, but actually positioning themselves so they can continue to do business with the UK, whatever the outcome. And I think that's the danger of it. We don't own the organisations that do business here, and as a result, we're slightly at the behest of the Japanese, the Americans, and whoever else. The people are just, we're just bit parts.
Yeah. Apart from American voters, if you're watching, you're making quite an important decision tonight. We have to mention, it's a big thing that's happening.
I just wanted to mention that different sectors, of course, will approach this very differently. Now, if I were to say what I would do with the universities and how I will bypass this whole thing, I would say that I will go almost entirely to distant and blended learning, particularly distant, because you bypass the whole talent thing, right? And then about research, it's a bit more tricky, but still you can do this digital nomad act, which bypasses, it doesn't matter where in the world you are, right? At the moment there is this opportunity as well with a lot of businesses. Well, there is a growing group of people who first don't have jobs because the jobs are gone, but also these are people who their businesses are digital, they're on the internet, so they live somewhere in the world and their business is in completely different part of the world because it is on the internet, right? Their customers are elsewhere. So,
certainly with financial services, there is no plan for a mass exodus, so my sources tell me, and they are the lawyers who act for the financial services, big institutions. There are thoughts about what happens if they cannot access the single market and lose passporting, in which case they have said that it will take them 4 years to try and relocate and create subsidiaries elsewhere if they don't already have an infrastructure in certain countries, but many do already. So it might not be that big a problem in reality. The key issue is talent, as I say, rather than where. And there is a lot of marketing going on by Dublin, Frankfurt and Amsterdam to entice some of these institutions into their countries. But, London at the moment has a huge attraction with the fact that we do have a tech and digital industry here that is the biggest in Europe, and the fact that we have the culture here. It's a good place to live. It's attractive for people to live and work in. So there's so much more about relocation than just that, where can we do business? And it might be more costly in the long term to relocate than stay put and see how things pan out. So there's no rush to exit the country.
It's interesting that as well, though, because I know people in digital who their alerts were going at 7:30 in the morning from places in Berlin in particular, saying, hello,
Yeah.
guten Tag, we're foreigners, we're going to see you soon, come on over. And that was one of the things that really struck me about what happened in the different industries, is I felt like the response from the UK side was quite slow, and the response from some of the people seeing the opportunity in other parts of Europe was much, much faster. They seemed to be much more prepared for us to be leaving than we were.
We were in shock, weren't we,
Yeah.
for a while?
I think there's a bit of shock. There's also, I think to our Peter's point, that you don't have to rush to judgment on this. And it's, of course, if you're sitting in Paris or Frankfurt or wherever, you are going to turn around and go, hey, we're open for business, come over here.
Yeah.
But the cost of doing that and physically relocating your whole organisation, or a sizable chunk of your organisation, bearing in mind that, yes, of course, some of your people will relocate with you, but a lot of them aren't going to. They're going to turn around and go, hang on a minute, I live here, all my life is here. Relocating permanently to another bit of the, of Europe potentially is not necessarily where I want to be. And so, I think that's why there is a whole load of phony war type stuff at the moment, until there is much more clarity on what the position is actually going to be. Because the other thing is, if you make all that change and you jump first and you actually wish you hadn't, then that could be a really expensive place to have ended up and have damaged yourself quite badly. So I'm not surprised that there's a lot of hedging going on, and that will continue for a long time, I think.
Yeah. We have another question over here. So are you brave enough to catch from there? Fantastic. I'm very
Okay.
impressed.
Right.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Okay.
Hey, it does work.
Fantastic. So for those on the webinar, we're just collecting the microphone from the corner of the room. But I think perhaps a 2020 javelin, perhaps over there.
Our sports team.
Hi, so I'm an academic social anthropologist from Oxford University, and I spent 5 years until 2012 studying the population of Swindon, the English working class population, the white English working class population, Indian Sikhs and the Poles, doing a town level study looking at perceptions of Britishness, life in Britain, and how people responded to changing currents in the local economy, demographic change in the environment around the town, when they reflected on how they felt about being British at the local level, and in response to stories from the news and from politics at national level. And the first question I have is around the kind of arrogance of the centre-left in London, particularly around Brexit, because one of my research questions was, where do people get their information from when they're thinking about national issues and themselves as a British person? The red tops in Swindon, the Daily Mail, a lot of information came from those media sources. I went to the IPPR, the famous left-wing think tank in London, to a discussion when Gordon Brown and his government were looking at setting up a constitution of British values and thinking about what the content might be, and the Ministry of Justice were going around the country doing road shows, asking the local population. And I said to the people on the panel that were kind of sharing their ideas about what should be in this very London multicultural lefty constitution, you really need to try and get your messages out through the red tops. And they said, oh no, we only talk to the Guardian. And I thought, you're bloody idiots. Moving forward, Swindon is a town, a post-industrial, former railway carriage manufacturing town with a kind of increasingly globalised economy. That vote is a typical Brexit voting town. And second point, people there were just simply fed up of what they felt was the globalisation of local jobs. There was no longer nationally owned manufacturing industrial job opportunities. Everything was some kind of service industry, satellite business with a foreign HQ offering service industry jobs. Lots and lots of people felt terribly disenfranchised there. And is there possibly a good side to Brexit, for example? I doubt this will happen under the current Tory government, but if we look at the Scandinavian countries that have focused a lot more on building their national economy, having very sensible social welfare policies, investing in the national rather than the global. And our focus in Britain is always so global. You know, what about trade relations overseas? What about the post-industrial depressed regions of Britain and Wales? Could there not be a kind of reverse of currents in those places? Because essentially what people are pissed off about is globalisation. And it's a kind of local reaction in the Brexit vote. So, you know, everything I've heard has been sort of centre-left London, Manchester sort of, but cosmopolitan centre type thinking, that's where I'm coming from too. But I think this is another dimension that needs to be discussed and acknowledged.
Yeah, I think so very much. And I think one of the things that strikes me when we did the Brexit debate, the pre-referendum debate, was in the discussion outside, was how the younger people in there was an expectation that they would be voting in, because of course they'd be this kind of metropolitan elite in a sense, and that feeling coming from them. But the other thing that struck me about it was the kind of, you come across this idea of the digital echo chamber, that a lot of people, because their news sources are predominantly through social media, which shows you more of what you've expressed an interest in, if you are pro-Clinton, the world starts to feel very pro-Clinton. If you're pro-Nigel, then it all becomes a bit Nigel flavoured in your thing. And I think that's, for me, was one of the things that debate around the referendum, I, personally, as a very personal opinion, I agree with you, but I'm really interested as the representative from the Northwest, of your take on it.
Well, I totally agree with what you said. I've worked in 4 universities over the last 30 years, and each university has always said, you know, to the local populace, think about all the great things we do. This is what we contribute to the local economy. And we always come up with a whopping big figure. We calculate it in terms of the impact. What we never say is, well, what else do we do to the local community? How else do we change the high street? How else do we change the feel of the local community? You know, so suddenly all the piano shops go and all the taxi firms come in and the pizza shops come in. Things change very, very quickly. We never calculate that. It's only at Manchester that we've actually started engaging with the local community. We've got members of staff who go out and talk to the local community. So I made the flippant remark about Fallowfield. But if you're living next door to a house that's having a major party every other night, then that changes how you think about everything from Brexit onwards. So we take it seriously, and I think, you know, one thing that Brexit, it took us so much by surprise, was because we're a bit of a bubble. And I think that's it, that we are a bit of a self-referencing echo chamber bubble. And it's about time that we get out a bit more.
You know, what's all this talk about the global economy and global trading partners? Where are the jobs in the regions by British-owned firms, you know?
Yeah, well, I used to work at Liverpool University, and the only people with Liverpool accents were the porters.
Yeah. Why are we not creating digital jobs for people in depressed areas of regional Britain? Why do we need to... I get the point about talent, and I've benefited from being able to work in America as an academic in Australia, but why are we not looking for more talent from bottom up in this country?
Now, you're raising a very interesting issue, and if I have to add something to that, now for a couple of decades now, one thing that has been bothering me a lot is that Manchester University at the moment is 32nd in global rankings, but it's always been about between 30th and 50th, 60th in the last 20 years or something, which is pretty high, right? And at the same time, just 100 meters behind our campus, we have an area where we have kids who have never ever spoken to anybody who's been to universities, right? And when I was Associate Dean of the faculty some time ago, I started a program where I sent quite a few PhD students out to these schools in this area. And I told them, if you need to rap about Bertrand Russell, you do it, right? You build cultural bridges. You get to these kids because we want these kids. But do you know why universities in Britain don't do it any longer? Because we've become neoliberal puppets. Yeah. Because we're too bothered with how to tie up our budgets and make profit and to talk pseudo business language that most of our administrators Sorry, don't even understand, right? So that is why, because we have forgotten that universities are a civilizing force. And that is what they have this big local effect about. Now, interestingly though, I want to mention something else. I saw some statistics that a lot of digital industry people are moving to Manchester and the areas around. And basically, we're cheaper, but we have all the opportunities, and it's still a place where you can live and you don't need to queue to get to into the metro station, which I find in London pretty kind of weird, actually, right? So people are moving, and we're still quite depressed in the north, right? Now, there's an elephant in the room as well. Jobs are going. Only people who can do relatively creative stuff will have jobs in the next 10, 20 years. And we have to raise the issue of universal income, right? It's not only about, we have to change the way in which we distribute wealth. Yeah. Sorry, that's not about world revolution, by the way. It's about practicality. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, it was funny, coming out of the tube on the way here, there was a poster about revolution. And all the way through the setup, I had you say you want a revolution, running through my head.
Politically, there is hope. I say that because Theresa May has taken on board a lot of the policies that were advocated in the manifesto of the Labour Party running up to the 2015 election. And two key issues that she's taken on board are, one, having an industrial strategy. Query what that means at the moment, but there is a focus now on industry and the need to ensure that we have industry in this country, growing industry. The second is the devolution of power and money from centralised London government, to the regions. And local communities need to be involved in that, and local regions know best where their areas of need, what their communities look like, and where the money should go. And from that, I think there is hope that we will begin to address the real problems underlying this, because you're quite right, Brexit is such a diversion from some serious issues, domestic issues at the moment, that are just completely being pushed aside. There isn't parliamentary time to discuss a lot of it, and this is a worry, because we might get the best deal, Brexit, but actually, what does that mean for the people in this country and the people that actually voted for Brexit? And I absolutely agree with you, but I think if it can be delivered, there is some hope there. Well,
yeah, I'd agree with a lot of the points you made as well. I think it didn't matter which side of the campaign you were on. I think it wasn't hard to look at it as a pretty unedifying spectacle in terms of the way it was conducted. I think, from a strictly personal point of view, I think absolutely there is, in the long term, it's a pretty good prospect. I was a Remainer, but it is what it is. We voted to leave. We've got to get on and do it. I think the challenge, as I see it, to your point about enabling people, is the people to some extent have to enable themselves too. I used to, when I was my former life in the Air Force, just over 10 years ago, I was commanding the base in Coningsby in Lincolnshire, which is a pretty sizable RAF base, just near Boston in Lincolnshire, and a lot of very agricultural area, a lot of farming, and a lot of East European migration, not least to go and do the agricultural work. And a lot of ethnic tension as a direct result of that. And one of the reasons, of course, that was the case is an awful lot of the Brits that lived there were pretty shameless about it, to be honest. They wouldn't work for the wages that the East Europeans were going to work for. And I think there is an element at the moment in our society that sits there and waits, okay, well, what's going to happen to us now? And actually, what's going to happen to us is we've got to get off our backsides and do something about it. And and if we want to genuinely capitalise on the opportunities that will be thrown up undoubtedly through all the negotiation, then we have to be self-motivating and in leadership style right through all of our communities, pulling people up to turn around and actually get on and do stuff that makes the opportunities that that undoubtedly are there. But if we don't do that, and you just sit there and wait for, effectively to be spoon-fed, you're going to be disappointed, I think. That's my view, and ultimately I wouldn't have a lot of sympathy with someone who does sit there in that under those circumstances and does that.
Interesting. Next question. I tell you what, I think you had your hand up earlier, so if we can...
Use that.
Didn't even have to catch it.
Oh, I'm sorry, I hadn't realised it had already happened.
Hi, okay, so I studied English literature and French at Manchester, and now my company manufactures PVC interlocking floor tiles in Luton. So, I employ a lot of Eastern Europeans. Why do I employ a lot of Eastern Europeans? Because there aren't people in Luton who can do the job that I need them to do. Why not? They haven't been educated properly, they haven't been motivated properly. So this goes back a really, really long way, and we need to start doing something about that very quickly. As you've been saying all night, talent is a serious, serious issue. But I totally agree with everything that you said about the number of disenfranchised people there are in this country. Huge, huge numbers. And we're going to see the same thing in the States tomorrow morning, unfortunately, I think. But I'm really sick of the press in this country constantly doing down manufacturing. British manufacturing is excellent. We are manufacturing some of the best quality goods in the world. We're selling it all over the world. And I'm so tired of the press constantly going on about how crap UK manufacturing is. It isn't. But people aren't motivated to go into UK manufacturing because they're constantly being told that it doesn't exist, they're not going to have a job in 2 years' time. It's absolute rubbish. The press has got a lot to answer for in many, many areas, but being negative about British manufacturing is one of the worst things that they are doing at the moment. And we need to put a stop to it right now and start really bigging up all the incredible stuff that goes on in this country. Why do so many French and German and people from all over the world want to come and work here, for goodness sake? It's a fantastic place to live, and there are good jobs if you are skilled enough to do them, but we're not educating our young people and not telling them about these jobs to motivate them to do it. It's crazy. Anyway, thank you.
Yep. I think I have to hand to Paul with the zombie job comment there, to kind of, how universities are responding to that.
Yeah, I think we're playing catch up, and I think there's a real danger that it takes us so long to put a course on, and then the market's changing so quickly. A statistic I came across recently was that since 2007, 83% of all job growth has been in self-employment in this country, and that's one thing that really excites our students. This is a generation that really doesn't want to work for organisations; they want to work with organisations for now. So I think it's how we talk about this, and how instead of us telling them about jobs to go into, we create career researchers who can go and find out about manufacturing and find out what it means, and then maybe works for themselves for a bit and then works with you and then does other things. But if you're going to stay going on about it, if you're going to have to stay working till your 80s, you've got to be flexible and you've got to know where the real jobs are. So we've got to get this across.
Sorry, did you say 80s?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Sorry.
I said that a while ago.
Very younger people, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was busily working out how I could convince my children to become trade negotiators so that I can have a sight of the Aston
If
Martin.
you're over 47, just be grateful we're all still here. Just be grateful.
But I think, in terms of the talent and the market, are you seeing the shift kind of with the way that people are looking at their jobs? Are you seeing that kind of on the ground?
Well, I put it into recruitment company context. Every 6 months, another 3,000 recruitment agencies are set up. So my gut feel is that the majority of those people are people at home thinking that they will be able to fill jobs through whatever portals there are. But I would suspect that would be, that's a statistic that would probably cover a lot of industries.
Yeah.
But we're not in a world where artificial intelligence or robo-advisors have started replacing people just yet. But I'm sure it won't be long. Personally, I find it quite exciting. But the one point I really wanted to grasp on was the globalisation point. So the lady that runs the manufacturing business, it sounds to me like your business has benefited hugely from globalisation. And actually, my impression is that, my view is that globalisation is a great thing and it ain't going to stop. The problem we've got is the distribution of wealth. You walk around Paddington, King's Cross, these areas are, I mean, they're paved with gold. You go down to where I'm from, which is Chichester, and it's a reasonably wealthy area, but anything to do with public services, infrastructure, rail is a complete shambles. And I'm sure it's exactly the same in Swindon and hosts of other places throughout the UK. And that is the failure for me. That's what makes me upset about Brexit, because I think it was a wholly avoidable thing.
Should we take another point, because you...
Don't let me throw it. Right, so I'm going to sort of change the direction of the discussion a little bit, because there were a lot of points around negotiation that were made, and I guess my question goes first to Arpita, but by all means, if whoever wants to pinch in, that's fine. So there's a lot of things said about the negotiation, but my question is, who is negotiating with who, right? We're talking about UK versus EU. From what I've seen on the referendum, it was England versus Scotland versus Northern Ireland versus Wales against France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Greece, Poland, you name it, right? Now, given that I'm Greek originally, my country has been through the same situation a year ago. It's not a negotiation between institutions. It's not a negotiation between countries, or I don't know how you call it, institution. Yeah, that's fine, I guess. So what is this about? That's my question. Who is speaking with who about what? I mean, you say the people. What people?
Yeah.
You say
Yeah.
Scotland, I guess, was right after the referendum. Scottish minister said, "Okay, EU nationals welcome in Scotland," sort of thing. Yeah. So what is this exactly? So that's my, I guess, question. So if you could please.
So who's negotiating with who, Arpita?
Well, you've highlighted the great difficulty. So ordinarily, there might be a one-on-one negotiation in any sort of employment negotiation, but there might be a lot of vested interests on the other side. Trade negotiations are often two countries, but lots of stakeholders. So here, when I talked about on our side, I obviously can't talk on behalf of the Prime Minister, but when she talks about the people, she means the people that voted for Brexit. That's what seems to always be said, which is of concern. So on our side. But what she also said when she came into power was that the name of her party is the Conservative and the Unionist Party, and that she would seek to maintain the union, come what may. That was still a priority. So she is, I think, doing that as well. So there is a difficult relationship here with the countries of the union. On the other side, there are 27 countries with different political community interests, vested interests that they will want to protect. And this is what makes this a very, very difficult negotiation. I think it was right that there was a hiatus between the 23rd of June and triggering Article 50, because it was such a shock to both sides. You can't negotiate in that climate where people are angry, frustrated and disappointed on the EU side. And of course, now we know there's a legal issue in terms of triggering Article 50 in any event. So I think it's good that there's been a period of reflection. Of course, there wasn't much of a plan, so there's been time to formulate that. But on the other side, it's a really good question. Germany and France have to be at the table. They're going to be key here. The problem we've got with that, they're facing elections, so we need them to be really focused at the table, but they're going to be looking domestically at their own internal politics as well. So there might be a period where they're a little bit diverted, and that won't help. But ultimately, any agreement's got to be ratified by the other 27 states, and therefore it has to be passed by each government. And that is a really big issue. The Romanians have said, you must be joking already, you're not going to get out of this with access to the single market and no ties with immigration. So I think voices have been heard already, things have been said. I think, I don't have an answer as to who is going to who's going to be the most persuasive, but Germany and France undoubtedly.
Well, I'm not really asking about who is going to be the most persuasive.
Okay,
I mean, my question is mostly related to who is on the UK side representing who, because you've seen that the Scottish side of the UK doesn't want the result. The English side, only the metropolis have done it. I think Manchester was a vote remained, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yep.
London was as well, but now no other counties, I think, in England. Sorry? Yeah.
But she has already,
You say
told the
there's a
Metropolitan League to shut up.
Yeah.
So I think that, in a sense, this isn't a negotiation now about London and Manchester, and it is about the interests of those that voted to leave, and to listen to the voices of business and what they want. But I'm afraid the rest of us are being told to be quiet and pipe down, live with the outcome and move on, and stop moaning. So I think we know. She said that very clearly both at conference and subsequently, and repeated that mantra. The people have said, we're leaving. And so that's who she's negotiating for. And she's already focused very much on workers. So politically, that's the voice that she's speaking with for the workers. She's got to be listening to the interests of the lobby groups for business. She can't not. But that's not what's being said out in the open. But there's lots of stakeholders in this negotiation. That's what's difficult, marrying the needs of all the stakeholders. But she says she's got quite a clear line of sight. The people, as I said, the people have said, limit immigration, come out of all EU laws. We are Great Britain. We can find our own way. And, that it seems to be the shape of that we're uncertain about, but we're looking to Canada and the EU and the trade agreement that they've managed to, take 8 years to seal the deal on, and look, there's hope. So I think it is the people. It's the people the people who voted Brexit, that she's saying, I'm going to put into place what you've asked us to do in this democratic referendum, through this democratic EU referendum. I can't think who else she'd be speaking for.
And I think something that a friend commented to me was that as much as the MPs were predominantly Remain, we've only had one by-election so far, which is somebody saying, I'm standing down because I can't be part of this process. So all of those Remain MPs with constituencies that voted out have chosen to stay representing those constituencies. So I suspect there's a lot of MPs, probably in places like Swindon and Boston and Lancashire, kind of turning around and saying, I'm sorry, what? I need to be listening as well as talking to people on the doorstep. I think that's possibly happening. So shall we have I think we've got a question from the webinar crowd. So we'll let Marcus have the...
Thank you. I'm going to be cheeky and pass on two that we've had a short while ago. So the first one's from Sarah McCullough. She's a 2012 graduate. A lot of this debate has been poisoned by negative narratives about immigrants, which has especially affected students, as the speakers pointed out earlier. What realistically can we do individually or collectively to challenge this narrative, and what should we replace it with? And I'll go straight in with a second question, if I may. This is from Richard V. Hurst, who's a 2008 MA Creative Writing graduate. Assuming it stands, how does the panel think the recent High Court judgment will impact on both the parliamentary process of triggering Article 50 and the wider political and economic climate?
Okay, so I think I'll give everybody a moment to think about how we change the prevailing negative narrative around immigration, and I think we have to ask the lawyer about the High Court judgment. Was it judgment?
So, what we know from the High Court is that there needs to be an Act of Parliament in order to give effect to sort of repealing the European Communities Act, triggering Article 50. What we know is that our Prime Minister has already assured Jean-Claude Juncker, that will not derail the timetable. So she still intends to trigger in March 2017. Why that's important to know is that that announcement gives some certainty to businesses and the markets. And she is trying to create as much certainty around an uncertain situation. What the odds are that the Supreme Court will uphold the decision in December. They will give us a speedy judgment. And the difficulty is now getting an Act of Parliament through a very, very restricted timescale, which has to be negotiated. So I'm not sure whether she can stand by the assurance that Article 50 will be triggered in March 2017. But she's given it, so she'll do her utmost to ensure that it does. It's the uncertainty that the challenge creates to businesses, people's mental health, actually, about what is going on. That's the biggest issue, uncertainty. Nobody can plan around uncertainty. And that's why I think she's trying to give a strong message that March 2017 is March 2017. And, come what may, that's the date. I think that's important, actually.
So if anyone has anything more to add on that, feel free. But if not, we'll address negative narratives around immigration.
Just on the Act of Parliament thing, it's a huge call for Parliament, to actually now, overturn the will of the people. I mean, clearly there was, it was a 70% turnout, clear majority. Whether you like the outcome or not, then back to your constituency point, I think if you're a constituency MP and you then turn up in Parliament because they're going to have to vote on it, and you vote, the opposite way to the way your constituency voted, that's going to be a pretty big call. You're probably going to find your time in Parliament is going to be terminated pretty quickly at the next election. So I think it'll be really interesting to see, no matter how strong their views are, and clearly a lot of them have got very strong views, what they actually say and how they vote come the day that if it goes to vote, regardless of whether, the Supreme Court may yet overturn it and it may be academic, but even if it does go to Parliament, I think it would be a massive, massive decision for Parliament to turn around and say, okay, no, we're not going to vote on it, we're not going to accept it, we'll overturn it. Now, I'm sure there'll be some, a whole load of prevarication around the edges, and not least in the Lords, but which is unsettling, and I completely agree. I think the one thing the markets and business hates is uncertainty, and that's not helpful for anybody in this country or in Europe for that matter.
I suppose that's when the argument comes to make it a resolution rather than a full bill, isn't it? It's because you're creating something that you can move faster. So
I don't think they can. That's just sort of nonsense, actually, legally. So she's got to go through the proper process. There's no, the lawyers are baffled about the prospect of if the Supreme Court says that you need to put a vote to Parliament, it's not a resolution. You need to have an Act of Parliament, and you don't get that by resolution. And the second point, more constituencies voted Leave than Remain. I think, from what I've heard from a lot of the Remain MPs, they have not refused to trigger Article 50. So I don't think it's going to be such a barrier. It's my bet.
But sorry, don't we... You're right. A lot of what is being talked by government officials, including our Prime Minister, I'm sorry to say, is legally nonsense. But this brings us to something else. Uncertainty has many faces, and one of them is the lack of trust in the people who are supposed to lead us into something. And my feeling is that I counted actually in the last 2 weeks, the government was taken to court 3 times and it lost 3 times. And I reckon this is not a very good sign for anybody. So we have to think about trusting government as well.
Well, they're not very experienced government, are they? They're not perhaps might like a little bit more experience through a big project like this.
Yeah, you can call it experience, Barnaby.
Well, no, I think that's a valid point. I mean, one of the things that struck me was how, we've got David Davis, Department of Exiting the EU, then you've got the International Trade under Liam Fox, then you've got Boris running the FCO, DFID are trying to get
Quite
their share of it.
experienced people.
They're quite experienced people, but they're not, as Barnaby says, in terms of pushing through a project, perhaps less experienced. But one of the things that again has fascinated me is the number of government jobs that are being advertised at the moment. You know, and I saw one advert for Director of Consumer Affairs where there was some sentence in it which was along the lines of, if you have experience of consumer policy, that would be a bonus. So I think, you know, that trusting, and then how you get this talent that we're talking about and getting the right people into the right places fast enough to move it along, when so much of that talent is from a non-British background. So then you're asking people from other places with different states to do different parts of the negotiation. It's yeah, there's a word that I would use, but I'm trying to restrain my vernacular.
Can I make a comment on the immigration question?
Yes.
Interestingly, in the immediate aftermath of the vote, I think quite a lot of big organisations and trade bodies, etc., were sort of summoned to go and talk to government about, you know, what their wishes were in terms of, you know, your big ticket things that you think we need to have on the table in terms of a negotiation discussion. And I think this whole talent, access to, you know, a big pool of labour and people with the right skills and so on, certainly, you know, I know from my firm was very, very high on that agenda. And I'd be really surprised if a lot of others were not saying the same thing. So, and it's been pretty widely trumpeted by politicians, indeed even in the media, you know, the value that we do get from immigration. And I think that, you know, the complicating factor around the way the vote came out, speaking strictly personally now, was, you know, I think a lot of the perception of why people voted to leave were the reasons that Peter has put very eloquently earlier on. You know, I'm not necessarily sure those were necessarily all the things that were clearly articulated as on the table. I don't think anyone said that if we leave, we're going to have no immigration. You know, people have jumped to a conclusion that has, you know, has never been put there as actually where we are politically, and, you know, and actually even just realistically. I mean, you know, that means, what does that mean for Brits going and working abroad for a start? So I think, you know, there has to be a sensible, you know, balance that comes into play here.
Yeah, and I think, are you seeing kind of in science and in recruitment, kind of that the negative narrative around immigration? Are you finding that you're talking to candidates who don't want to be based in the UK because of how they perceive the climate to be?
No, actually, no, not in the slightest. I've seen no change whatsoever. The only change that we are saying is the type of job. So we do a lot on the interim contract basis, and a lot of our clients are hiring contractors. We're up sort of 30% on the contract side and down on the senior positions. But no, that doesn't. You know, I think we're in there's 2 years from whenever we trigger it, and that's quite a long time.
There's a lot of local initiatives that have now started, because in as much as it's been horribly divisive, there's been a lot of solidarity shown as well. And a lot of local initiatives that are taking on board this sort of more in common type issue, where people are now having dialogues and talking to each other because they feel that they are more together as a result of this, you know. And employers also being a little bit more open about assisting their employees around immigration issues, so signposting those that are EU nationals and who might have got to 4 or 5 years and be able to get a certificate to actually stay, and, you know, help them build some certainty around their lives and direction just by being a bit more open around these particular issues, and supportive and understanding that this is an uncertain time, it might be an uncertain time in people's lives, and they can be helpful around that. But there are things that people can do, such as when they see incidents, to call it out, to report them, to give support to the individuals who might experience any form of hate incident, or feel that they're being excluded. And there's quite a lot of posters out there telling who to report to, what support you can give, and lots of organisations now that are willing to come together to build those local structures, recognising that this is a difficult time for many people.
We are getting to the point of the evening where I'm going to have to say that we're heading towards last questions. But I think given the flow of the discussion, we'll call that kind of in 10 minutes. So I reckon we've got time for another 2 or 3 topics. So I think you've had your hand up before, so if we can move to you and then perhaps come over there, Anthony.
I just wanted to ask the panel a little bit more detail on what they think the future immigration model should be, taking into account a few things which I had discussed before. Since up to 1997, we had fairly low immigration, and it wasn't at all on the political radar at all. It was pretty much a non-issue. Right now, the population's increasing by about 1 million every 3 years. I think that is a big factor about what people voted for Brexit. And the metropolitan elite need to recognise that it is affecting people in a disproportionate way. International students are very important, but unfortunately, a lot of people have used it as a route to permanent residence as a primary purpose. It's fine with a Russell Group uni such as this one, but I know from experience of working in East London that it is a way to circumvent normal routes into the country. And this happens in Australia and the States as well. Those countries that I just mentioned are able to give visas very easily to scientists and experts who want to live in those countries. Why do you need freedom of movement, which is actually quite an anomalous position on a worldwide scale? For example, US and Canada have the NAFTA free trade agreement. They don't have freedom of movement. You can have something called a TN1 visa, which allows you to work for up to a year if you have a job offer and you're a skilled professional. Couldn't we implement something like that in the sort of post-Brexit world? And the other thing is, freedom of movement is a wonderful idea, but as Paul said, 1% of Brits go over from Manchester go over to work on the continent. Unless you are very good at languages and you're able to penetrate the impenetrable, protectionist, sometimes very xenophobic continental jobs market, your chances of finding gainful employment on the continent, apart from being a club rep, are close to zero. So, or unless you set up a bed and breakfast or are self-employed or something. So with those realities in mind, what sort of model do we need post-Brexit?
Interesting. And I think one comment I would make to the 1.4% is that a Delhi stat? Is that yeah. So that's looking at people in the immediate 6 months
after graduation.
One of the issues around higher education statistics is we don't have a national model which tracks where those people go longer term. So I would guess that there's a proportion of people in this room who have successfully navigated working in some of the countries that you're talking about and have found it straightforward. And I think the other interesting thing for me about the Indian trade delegation was one of the things they were asking for was the reinstatement of the 2-year post-study work visa so that students were in a position to repay some of the costs associated with that. But how do we do it? How do we have, I mean, do we move to a US and Canada model? Do we have a black market economy of cash in hand jobs because you can't get a visa, or do we reform it altogether? The floor is yours. We've been talking all night about a lack of leadership on these issues. So.
I mean, well, I'll throw a couple of points out. I'm no immigration expert. I think a lot of it is going to depend on what kind of model and what kind of relationship we want with the EU. I mean, everything I have seen and read suggests that if you want to go down the closer relationship, so you want a Norway model, there is not, in my view, a cat in hell's chance we're going to get that without free movement. You know, it's just going to be a complete red line for the EU, and so that drives you the more tightly you want to control immigration and be restrictive around EU migration in particular, then the further you are going to be driven away from any of those models, and you're more into a sort of WTO type scenario. Is that survivable? Of course, I'm sure. And then once you get to that, you then decide who you want and how you want to bring them in and how you're going to limit them. I think you're still going to need to allow talent flow and migration flow to a level, and in order just to make the country work. I think anything else is unthinkable. I certainly, just again from a personal point of view, the one thing I think we should be much harder on is economic migration. There's no question about that. I think it's just not appropriate given the world we live in now and the system we have and the challenges we face with demographics and so on in the country at large. But frankly, some of just be careful what you wish for, isn't it? But we weren't in Schengen. We weren't about to join Schengen, and so we already, to a large degree, had some control.
Well, but the only difference with Schengen was that you needed to show your passport when you came to the border. It didn't make really that much difference.
Yeah, you're right, but I'm not sure that, for example, I would bet, and this is a slightly different topic, I appreciate to the one you're raising, but I would be amazed if the French don't hand us back our own border. I know it's not an EU-specific thing, it's a bilateral treaty. But and then the challenges around illegal migration are just going to be all the greater. So I think it is a huge problem going forward. It's not a great answer to your question. I think whatever we do is inextricably linked to whatever sort of relationship we want with the EU. And at the moment, there seems to be a cake and eat it desire in an awful lot of people that they want this very close relationship with the EU, but they want to turn around and stop all the bits they don't like, and it's just not realistic.
But it's not just our problem, is it?
No, absolutely.
There's plenty of other countries across the EU with exactly the same issues. And the frustration for me is that we haven't had our leaders, Cameron, Blair, Brown, actually in Europe having the debate. And Theresa May made a speech, I think it was at the UN, which was trying to reposition immigration and actually trying to position Europe as a whole, or perhaps immigration as a whole, as something which economically or whatever else is not a benefit to any of the countries, whether they be Greece, the UK, or anywhere else. And I think that the shame for me is that we're only just having this conversation. It's become a racist conversation. It's not what it should be.
Yeah. Mayor, because you asked about an innovation model, no?
The what?
Innovation model. Now, one part of my job is that I suppose you do it as well. I interview a lot of colleagues for jobs in Manchester, right? And I have to confidently tell you that when somebody comes from the Netherlands and applies for a job, nobody else stands a chance of getting this job because they're just very good. And do you know why they're good? Because of their whole education system, right? And that is, if you decide to turn it around, well, yes, Britain can survive, but I think it will take us about 30 years because it starts from primary education. And it starts from what we teach our kids, how we teach them. At the moment, we teach them to pass exams, right? So they end up without knowledge, without motivation. They know how to pass exams mostly, right? So it will take a very long time. But in what you raised, just like in football, there are the two models. The Chelsea and what used to be Manchester United, right? So we can decide to become a Manchester United. It just kind of is a bit less certain outcome in the short run than the Chelsea model. Okay? No, because you see here, we have to make it. I fully agree that, and I was one of the people who raised it, we can't want the privileges without some responsibility. But it is the same with any decision we make. We can decide anything at different levels in this country at the moment. This way, the opportunities are limitless. But we have to be completely honest about the limitations of our decisions. And again, as associate adopted Brit, I can say one thing that I love in this country is that we endure. Even Brits who adopted Brits, we learn to endure. So if we decide to endure, yes, in about 40 years, Britain will be a wonderful place.
It wasn't a joke, by the way.
Britain's a wonderful place now, and it will always be a wonderful place.
No, but
let's
we,
be absolutely clear. Manchester's a great place.
Yeah. We'll still be working. Yes.
The moment I knew Brexit was on, was there was a debate with. Do you remember David Cameron stood up to give a debate about this, and people asking him questions. So it was a very articulate chap, just like you raised this question. Cameron couldn't answer it. He ducked it. He had no way of answering to the concerns people had about immigration. He had no way of answering it. All he did was switch it back to the economy and his mate George and his Armageddon predictions, you know. And I thought then that he's got no strategy, he's got no plans, and people saw through that. And I thought that's where when the vote was lost.
It's interesting, and I think your point about whether it's immigration or race and how that's framed, and then, you know, they're saying, well, you've made it easier for the Chinese to come in, but we can't get the Indians in, but you're saying we want to do the deal. And the whole thing, I think there's so many different signals coming from so many different places on that very specific topic. And whether you're in Swindon or East London, you know, these are conversations. I think one of the things as well about this discussion tonight for me is how conscious I am that the things we're talking about are being talked about on sofas all over the country right now, and they're being talked about by people who haven't felt an engagement in a national debate for a very long time. And the question about what we can do individually as well, I think that's where alumni and people who've had the opportunity to be trained to think and to have these discussions, for me on a very personal level, these are very important conversations to be having in public spaces as well as on sofas. Can we go here and then here, I think? So, Ravin, Patch? Good job.
I think we have to be patient, like the dog here has been fantastic through the whole thing. Really good. I was going to mention immigration as my first point, and you've covered it succinctly, but to sum up as well, that we've had this huge uncontrolled migration, economic migration, and that's caused people to be upset. It's not racism, it's just a problem. And people have voted, one clear vote has been to say, let's control that, because it doesn't work. So, first point. Second point is trust with the government, because uncertainty is going to cause us more pain and more problems than anything else. You've seen the fluctuations in the exchange rate, the FTSE, all of that. And in daily lives, you've talked about stress in students, worrying about at every level. I'm seeing it in primary schools where I work. Kids are stressed because their parents are stressed. So we need to get behind the government and be positive. We have voted out. Now we've got to make the most of it, and it's hard to do when you've got a 50-50 vote. It was 49-51. People are not decided. That's not a clear vote. It's not a clear mandate. But, well, it is leave, so we've all got to get behind that. The point that I wanted to throw into the discussion, maybe we can chat individually outside, was the EU now has a vested interest to see the UK suffer incredibly and painfully in the next 18 months, because there are some key elections happening where far-right parties are using immigration, etc., as ways of getting votes to say, there are many countries in Europe. So the more the UK suffers, the more likely they will not get the vote. So each day that you see newspaper articles about the UK suffering, these people are less likely to vote. So the EU, there is a vested interest of some senior politicians and bureaucrats to make the UK suffer. And I think we're going to feel that. You'll see that happening in different ways. Thank you.
I don't think anybody would disagree with that. So perhaps we can come to this comment down there at the front.
There you go.
Wow. I have to say, I'm very impressed with how you all played with it.
Oh, very smart, yeah. Can I just for the moment hark back to this question about who is Theresa May negotiating on behalf of? Because if a lot of the people who voted to leave will say emotional things like, we don't want these foreigners telling us what to do, we don't want our laws being made in Brussels, we don't want all these foreigners coming over here and taking our jobs. It's all a bit xenophobic, but very emotional. On the other hand, various business organisations are now putting together their submissions to government about what they want out of Brexit. And I was at one of the engineering institutions last week, and they're putting their submission together, and it's tariff-free trade with Europe, open trade with the Europeans, a hand in setting European standards, freedom to hire wherever we like, even if it's from Europe. And as you go down the list, you're realising what they're saying is we actually want to stay in the EU. So if Theresa May is negotiating on behalf of the UK, and she's got two totally diametric opposed objectives, how can you negotiate to get two things which are mutually unbridgeable?
So UK PLC versus the people.
Versus 17 million people.
Some of the people.
There are 60 million people in the country, and 17 went out to say leave. Almost as many said stay, and a quarter of the population I didn't know or didn't care, so they didn't say anything. So, I mean, from a negotiating point of view, one thing is you're asking for two separate things for two separate audiences. And if I could just throw in a supplementary point, have you ever gone into a negotiation where you've been told at the outset you have 2 years to complete, and if you don't complete in 2 years, you get nothing? Because that means as soon as you start, your negotiating position is gone, because it's take it or leave it. Whatever the EU gives this country, that's it, or nothing. Is that right?
So most negotiations are time limited in a certain way. They are not open-ended. And it can be, indeed, that you come away with nothing. But the starting point is that there must be a mutual interest to reach their deal. That's why you're at the table. And so we have to explore those mutual interests. This has to be done in the spirit of a principled negotiation, but diplomatically. So what we can't have, for example, are quite scathing comments by our MEPs in the European Parliament telling people they've never done a day's work in their lives. You know, things like that don't really set the tone for the negotiation that we need to have. We know sometimes a timescale actually focuses the parties' minds, because the alternative is not what either party wants. So it could be a good thing that it's time limited and restricted, but we know what the scenario will be at the end if we don't meet that deal. You know, we're in WTO territory there. And also the parties do have the ability to extend the timescale for that negotiation if they mutually agree to do that. So there's scope. But I think that is less likely to happen. I think there's probably a 6-month window for an extension. And the reason I say that's less likely to happen is because we are facing an election in May 2020. And what Theresa May has said is, we will vote on the outcome of this negotiation. And that outcome will be the manifesto commitment, and you either like it or you don't, and you vote your government in accordingly. Now that 2020 election will happen, and we have to vote on the basis of something. And I think she has a plan. That's a plan. So I think they will do their utmost to try and get some form of outcome by, that's within that timescale. Whether that's achieved, but we don't fall off a cliff at that point. We don't. The other point is all the interests at the table, industry's interests and the people's interests. The immigration and the economy are symbiotic. To say they're not is unrealistic. It's just not real, So she will have to, in my view, negotiate in the country's economic interests. And the problem we have with immigration in this country is that we need our strawberry pickers and we also need our rocket scientists. And somehow we've got to square that circle. What we have got time to do is train up our strawberry pickers. We don't have enough time really necessarily to train up our doctors in 2 years' time and nurses and those. So we have to look at what we need for our economy, and I think that might be what she looks at when she starts to look at negotiating an immigration policy that works for this country. Of course, I think she will take on board all the interests of the major economic powerhouses that are powering our economy at the moment and aren't really going to change in the next 5 to 10 years. she is going to take on board the interests of engineering, tech, digital, financial services, but she just might not be able to meet them. And that's the reality. Not all, you can please all some of the people some of the time.
Have you got anything to add?
Well, that's a great point. She's unelected.
Yes.
How many people actually go out to vote in the first place? How many then voted for Leave? How many might have voted for Theresa May? And the whole thing is just, the underlying theme of tonight is a bit of a shambles. And none of us have entrusted none of us have entrusted Theresa May with the right to negotiate her way out of the shambles.
I'm sure when the history books are written, there'll be a debate about whether they set the bar at the right level, whether they needed to have obviously it's pretty clear Cameron didn't need to have the vote in the first place, chose to do it. He could have turned around and said, right, it has to be a 70% mandate. They didn't do any of that, therefore it becomes pretty academic. I mean, whichever side of the argument you were on before the 23rd of June, the outcome's the outcome. I think if it had been a 40% turnout, it might have been a slightly different conversation. The fact that it's such a big turnout, notwithstanding there were obviously a lot of people that still didn't vote. They had a choice, if they chose not to vote despite everything that gone on, unlucky.
I don't agree with that. I think it's been framed by Theresa May following the vote, and it could have been framed very differently. I don't think that 52-48 is convincing, even with the 70% turnout. And I think the way the Brexit was positioned by Johnson and whoever else was involved was shambolic.
They were shocked.
And anyone voting Brexit didn't know what they were voting for.
Yes.
About,
too many issues.
Sovereignty or immigration. I mean,
the NHS. We'll save money, give it to the NHS.
I think Cameron has done a terrible job for us, but I don't think Theresa May has done any better job. I think there were opportunities to reposition the debate, and she hasn't taken them.
I actually think she's still displacing, to answer your question. A lot of it is still about the Tory party, I think. And how do you kind of make sure that they don't eat you alive as their leader?
Well.
Right? Sorry.
Well,
we'll have to kind of say these things.
Well, yeah, I mean, you get eaten in the Conservative Party, you get punched if you're in UKIP, and you just have interminable conferences if you're in the Labour Party. I said to Wyman, I think we're going to have to finish this part of the proceedings here. However, we are not throwing you out into the street. Those of you on the webinar, you're going to have to go make your own cup of tea and do that kind of thing. But for those of you in here, there will be drinks and canapes and the opportunity to continue this conversation. I would like to say a huge heartfelt thanks to the panel, to our Peter, Barnaby, Maria, Bob and Paul. Before we allow you out to your own conversations, we asked the panel to think about a key takeaway point to offer you to close, which is what I'd like them to do. I'd also like to thank you guys for your contributions, because I think that's really made this evening, and I'm very impressed with the throwing and catching skills on that. So perhaps if we run Paul to up into
two quotes from two really important people, my grandmothers. One was from Ireland, and she used to say, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans, which is very relevant. The other one was English, and she used to say, keep calm and carry on.
I'll do the quote thing as well. It's Dwight D. Eisenhower who said, the plan is nothing, planning is everything. And I think, we are where we are, and it's all about how we plan our way out of it in terms of individual through to big collective level.
Opportunities always come with consequences, and we have to be aware of them.
Well, I'll do the quote thing too. It'll be all right on the night.
I was actually going to say to Catherine, you've done a sterling job, but that would just mean that you've done a worse job than you did before.
Sorry. On that note, on that bombshell, but no, thank you all for coming and not just staying up to watch the US election results come in. Please continue the conversation, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. The next one of this series is going to be in February, and we will be talking about the future of the NHS. So another small topic to tackle. Oh yes, and you've got some feedback forms, I think, to complete as well.
Please fill in the feedback. That's the best way for us to find out if we're doing the right job.
That was great. Yes, thank you. You did very well as well.